Hello, everybody. Welcome to Parallax Academy, our podcast. I'm here with Andrew Cohen, and I'm just going to read his bio because he has a rich story and a rich history. And he's just written a book that I've finished reading the other day called When Shadow Meets Bodhisattva. Andrew is a spiritual teacher, an author, a cultural visionary, and inspirational speaker. From 1991 to 2010, he was editor-in-chief of the award-winning Enlightenment magazine, a widely cherished publication that explored the deepest existential questions of our time with some of the world's most noted thought leaders. Andrew has become known for his willingness to boldly cast aside the sacred cows of the spiritual world. His work grapples with demystifying the wealth of knowledge found in the great traditions and with making enlightenment deeply relevant to a postmodern audience. In 2020, he and a small group of collaborators launched the online project Manifest Nirvana, a virtual ashram and monastery of the future, which Andrew has called a home for sovereign souls, radical spirits, and integral pioneers. In his 3 decades of teaching and lecturing, he has developed a unique and powerful vision for a truly contemporary spirituality, combining evolutionary theory and integral development practice with the timeless wisdom of the perennial philosophy. Departing radically from a traditional Eastern approach, Andrew's pioneering Dharma evolutionary enlightenment calls not for transcendence of the world, but a deep and heroic responsibility for evolution. Okay. So welcome, Andrew. Thank you for coming in and talking to us here.
My pleasure. I just wanted to say at the beginning that 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with Parkinsons disease. So as a result, sometimes my facial expressions are a little wooden, but it's just that they don't always indicate my actual emotional state. So I just wanted people to take that into consideration. Sometimes I look a little stiff, but I'm not, even when I'm not feeling stiff inside.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I just read your book, and you've been through an incredible journey, I would say. I think you've reached great heights and great depths. I think you've been to heaven and hell both, I would say.
That's very true.
And you've written this book, which is partly a reinstatement of your desire to teach your evolutionary enlightenment program, and also there's a repentant aspect to it for mistakes you've made in the past, and the fact that I think one of the big takeaways from the book that I got was this intense drive you had in the beginning towards transcendence and the humanizing process that you went through. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, it's very fair. It's very accurate. When part of, I guess if we look at the spiritual process in the context of evolution, what it actually entails is, awakening to the non-relative or absolute dimension of reality as a direct experience, as a direct cognition of knowing the ultimate miracle that exists beyond life and death as the ultimate touchstone and ultimate reference point, which is the awakening to enlightened awareness. And the other is to find a way to become deeply human, deeply vulnerable and unconditionally real, genuine and authentic. And the second part usually requires an enormous degree of suffering, unfortunately, because genuine humility is usually hard won by most of us. It certainly has been for me.
Yeah, that also is I think I would say that one of the biggest meditations that we could have from your book is what that would mean. Genuine humility and embodiment. I have a question which might be a little bit indiscreet, but you did mention your Parkinson's condition at the beginning, and I wonder if that has anything to do with this humanization process, like because I was thinking of Ram Dass. You know who Ram Dass? Ram Dass.
Of course.
He had a movie and that I watched on Netflix, and he had a stroke. And he said that after his stroke, his students could relate to him as a person on earth, whereas before he was this kind of spirit. He was this very kind of like big guru, like perhaps you've been in the past. And so I thought of you with his statement. I don't know if that is a bad question, but
I don't. I don't know. I've never asked any of my students if my disease helps me to be seen more as a vulnerable human being than I have been. No one's ever told me that, so I don't actually know. But it could be. It could be. But I have. Because I was and I still am fundamentally a transcender. I mean, to me, that's what I was always most interested in, and what I still is still my highest and greatest value is the experience of transcendence, or the actual genuine awakening to enlightened awareness as a potent, living, vibrating experience of self-realization and enlightenment. But as Ken Wilber has made clear, the experience of higher and liberating states of consciousness don't necessarily make us transparent to ourselves at a psychological and emotional level. And my biggest shadow was that I didn't think I had a shadow, which when I think about it now, it seems kind of ridiculous, but it was true. I thought that I was utterly self-transparent to myself in a way in which nobody actually is. So I had to go through a lot to kind of come to terms with that, and atone for that kind of avoidance and denial of myself.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about the vulnerability of the human state, the body, versus this thing called enlightenment, whatever that is, from people who, like myself, who don't know what that is, that it would seem like an ideal or something to strive towards, and perhaps it is.
But the enlightenment, oh, absolutely, nothing more important.
But at the same time, it's supposed to be like the already existing state, and at the same time, we're in a body, and we have this experience of limitation in a body or whatever.
Well, the way I like to think about it, and you were telling me that you're on a Vajrayana path. So my understanding comes from this. I think I've heard of this way of speaking from, I think, Mahayana Buddhism, which declares that there's two dimensions to reality. One is absolute and one is relative. So manifest reality would be considered to be relatively real from that point of view. Real, but relatively real. And absolute reality is absolutely real. So it's that all-important distinction between that which is absolutely real and that which is relatively real. So the awakening to enlightened awareness is when we become cognizant and aware of the palpable presence of that which is absolutely real, and that begins to inform our awareness and awaken our heart and mind, and liberate us instantaneously from fear and self-consciousness and the contraction of the small self. So it's the experience of the infinite expansion of reality, and the direct cognition of that fact, which is so, as I say, instantly liberating. And in that state, there's a mysterious recognition of the ground of eternity seems to suddenly become obvious and ever present, and to repeat, inherently liberating. So that would be the absolute non-relative context. But then there's still relative reality, the world of manifest existence, and so our emotional and psychological challenges appear within the context of relative reality, as would our physical experience of physical embodied existence, and the problems that can come up in that dimension of experience also. So of course there's obviously a connection between the two, but it's not always clear what that connection is. I remember the first time I visited Ramana Maharshi's ashram, and he's obviously considered universally as one of the most powerful realizers of the 20th century. His awakening is undisputed and considered to be at the highest level. But he died of cancer. He got cancer, I think, in his arm. And there are pictures at the ashram showing him near death, and he was wincing in agonizing pain. And many powerfully and profoundly awakened people have died painful deaths. So there's not any inherent relationship between the awakening to the ground of being, or to the ground of consciousness itself, or to the ground of eternity, and physical well-being, unfortunately.
Mm. Mm. So what about the path then? I was thinking as you were speaking of, I think his name was Robert Johnson. He was a Jungian, and he went to meet Krishnamurti when he was very young. And Krishnamurti was always telling everybody, just like, awareness is everything, and that's all that matters, and everything else is. And he was very frustrated by that, because and Krishnamurti would say, "Oh, do you understand what I'm talking about?" When he would talk about, the state of ultimate being and awareness, and he didn't understand it. So he had to go through all this sort of Jungian therapy, or get various levels of understanding before he could understand what Krishnamurti was talking about. And in the end, he said he was very angry at Krishnamurti because Krishnamurti didn't give him a way, or a path, or a direction, So I wonder if the non-dual teachers in India often play this trick on us. Is my question make any sense? I'm also speaking from personal experience too, because I spent a lot of time reading Nisargadatta Maharaj, his books, and it was all about the absolute. And then I felt it was real, but I didn't know how to get there, and I still don't.
Well, my guru, the great H.W.L. Punja, who was a disciple of the great Ramana Maharshi, played that trick on me.
Uh-huh.
And I'll tell you what happened. But before I do, just to make clear that, yes, so the problem is that a lot of these realizers of the perspective of Advaita Vedantas, they reveal the absolute to us. And they say the absolute is all there is. The absolute alone is real. And there can be an explicit or implicit denial of the relative dimension of reality. Mm-hmm. And so for a lot of people like you and me, we say, well, even if we've had a glimpse, even for people who've had glimpses of absolute reality, which exists beyond the mind, beyond time, space, and thought. Yes, but what do I do? How do I live in the world? How do I make sense out of the challenge of the human experience within the context of this kind of realization? And then often a teaching like that doesn't have any answers. They just say, just don't take it too seriously. So my teacher, that's what he did to me. And the most extraordinary thing happened when I met him. I'd been meditating for about 9 years very seriously when I met him. And I was very serious about enlightenment. And I was a very serious meditator. And I was one of the most serious people that I'd met in the group of seekers that I hung out with in India. And I was told about this extraordinary teacher who was a disciple of Ramana Maharshi, who very few people at that time knew about. So when I met him, I thought I knew what I was doing. So anyway, I sat down in front of him, and he was sitting on his bed and I was sitting on the floor, and I said to him, "How much effort do I have to make if I want to be free? How much effort do you have to make if you want to be free?" And he whispered, barely audibly, "You don't have to make any effort to be free."
I knew that was the answer. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you read the book. So I didn't understand intellectually, I had no idea what he was talking about. But after he uttered those words, I had an experience in the eye of my mind. I saw water flowing down the side of a mountain. I realized that my own true nature was like that water, ever unobstructed and always freely flowing. And then it became obvious to me spontaneously that unenlightenment was merely a thought. That's what happened in about 20 seconds. And the minute that happened, he shouted out loud. We had not been talking. He shouted out loud, "That's it!" And I looked up and I said, "How did you know?" He said, "When a man sees his own face, he recognizes it." That was the beginning of my introduction to this extraordinary teacher. So he was the most radical teacher I'd ever met or I'd ever heard about, because he simply said, consciousness is already is already enlightened, is already self-liberated. And if you realize that there's nothing to do except accept it and surrender to that fact, there's nothing to do. And he said, how can you approach that which is timeless by doing something in time? He thought it was a fallacy, he thought it was ridiculous, because the idea for him is you have to do something to transcend time. You're already pushing the immediacy of your own liberated state away from you. Just with that thought, I have to go and sit down and meditate, or I have to do such and such a practice. So you're pushing away your own naturally inherent, already enlightened state of consciousness. So it's one thing to understand it intellectually, and it's another thing to know that at the level of experience that it exists prior to thought. So after I spent these 3 weeks with him, pretty much on my own, he told me that something profound was going to happen to me when I left him, and I didn't believe him. I said, how does he know what's going to happen to me when I leave him? Who does he think he is? I was full of doubt. Because when I was with him, I was wondering, is this an extraordinary spiritual master? Is this some crazy old man that doesn't know what he's talking about? I really wasn't sure. But anyway, after I did leave him, when I was sitting on the train, there was this explosion happened, this metaphysical explosion. It happened in my body and my nervous system. It lasted for about 3 weeks. And after that, I wasn't the same person anymore. And when I went back to see him, the first thing he said to me is, he said, and this answers your question. He said, Andrew, I'm so glad you found a friend you'll never be able to see. He said, Andrew, I'm so glad you found a friend you'll never be able to see. So he was a teacher of the end of the path, and that's all he taught. And a lot of people, of course, were as a result. So he transmitted enlightened awareness directly in ways that I haven't heard of other teachers doing, even though I'm sure they do. But he didn't teach any path. Any path, and I felt in all humility that this left a lot of people wanting, because the experience itself doesn't answer the question of how shall I live.
Yeah,
how do I
can't just talk about it, right? In other words,
how do I make sense out of the challenge of being a human being in a complex world? That's what sensitive, smart, intelligent, thoughtful people want to know, is how do I make sense out of the human experience in this challenging, complex context of manifest reality, as a human being. And he didn't have any answer to that question, and a lot of non-dual teachers don't, and I think they leave people wanting. So as a result of that, I, over the period of the next 10 years, created my own teaching of evolutionary enlightenment, which tried to bring together the awakening to what he was teaching was the direct awakening to the unmanifest dimension of reality as a direct experience, and also the awakening to the manifest aspect of reality, which is an evolutionary process. Manifest reality is not static being, but is the swirling energy and intelligence that gave rise to energy and matter, which created the conditions that made it possible for life to emerge, and from life, mind, and self-reflective awareness, finally. And so we find that our experience of being human is at the tip of this extraordinary creative unfolding. And how do we make sense out of that and take responsibility for that, and get into the driver's seat of all that within the context of our own conditioned body, mind, and personality? And then, to me, that's really the challenge of enlightenment in the time we're living in. It's not just an enlightenment that's just about being in the experience of transcendental peace and liberation, but it's also how can I, from that liberated perspective, get creatively get into the driver's seat of not only of my own life, but of life itself, because we're all living the same life ultimately. If life is a singularity, how could I experience my life as an expression of that singularity, not just my personal ego trip and my personal story?
Maybe I want to ask you about why you chose to sort of create a tradition. I mean, I guess you're using a lot of traditions, that were around you at the time, like Integral and other teachers, and why you would I was thinking about how they, like you said, your teacher was teaching non-duality, and so he wasn't teaching a path. And there are paths, like there's lots of them. Like I think in Vajrayana, there's 83,000 different practices you could do or something like that. Or they said that's a different tantric practices you could do. And I've also practiced a bit of Zen, and in Zen, all you do is meditate, right? Or chant and meditate and walk and work. And so I think it's kind of interesting that, so my question is like, why would you not pick a tradition that was already there and work within that? And why did you feel you had to work outside of a tradition?
Well, because
maybe you weren't working outside of a tradition, but anyway.
Well, it was because my tradition ultimately was my guru, which is Advaita Vedanta. And then when I started teaching, a lot of people were having these very powerful wake-up experiences very quickly around me, very dramatically. But then at a certain point outside my presence, I noticed that a lot of people kind of fell back into their own ordinary neurotic habits. And at a certain point, I realized that, there's no shortcut to this. Everybody's got to do the work. So that's when I started encouraging people to meditate, to practice meditation, contemplation, introspection. And then I realized people needed to be taught how to think. Because I started realizing, because I still do encouraging people to be able to think in constructive and consistent, rationally consistent ways about reality. Because a lot of spiritual people that are interested in spiritual matters think that thinking clearly is not very important. And I realized that the experiences that we have are not as important as our way of understanding them is. It's the conclusions we draw about their significance, more important than the experience itself. So I was encouraging people to pursue meditation, contemplation, introspection, clear cognition. We started practicing dialogical processes where we were learning how to speak in very clear and rationally consistent ways about the difference between relative reality and absolute reality, etc., and learning how to make sense out of the human condition, and then looking into the moral implications of awakening to enlightened awareness. There are a lot of questions that are very important that we need to sink our teeth into and kind of come to clear understanding of. When metaphysical higher states of consciousness are not enough, we have to really know who we are, where we are, what we're doing here, what our intention is in this life, I think, in order to make the Enlightenment mean something. So I was really learning on the job. When I started teaching, I was trying to teach as my teacher did, which was just to give people the direct experience of no mind and feel that maybe that's enough. And I realized for most people, it just wasn't enough in the long run. And then when people started doing, spiritual practice and meditation and contemplation and introspection, etc., a lot of the traditional stuff that I was teaching them and people do, I started seeing them learn and grow spiritually. And I realized that the old-fashioned way works, and we need to do. There's only one way to do this. And ironically, my teacher, when he found out I was giving people spiritual practices, got very upset because he felt I was ruining his teaching.
Wow.
Which I guess I was, but I knew people needed more than just non-duality. It's the rarest of souls that a glimpse of non-duality will set them free unconditioned forever. That just doesn't happen very often. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but it can happen once in a very long while. And for most people need to struggle. Most need to struggle with the complexity of being human, with our conditioned minds and emotions and souls, that we all have to come to terms with. And the experience of non-duality itself doesn't take any of that away. It liberates us from it if we understand it. But it doesn't inherently make everything simple and clear, direct and obvious. Unfortunately, it just requires some serious ongoing spiritual work and vulnerability. And that's what I was trying to, and I think I succeeded at inspiring people to be vulnerable and sincere and serious. And I think in order for the spiritual path to be lived in earnest and to actually lead somewhere that actually means something, that leads to a higher state of development, it needs sustained sincerity over a long period of time. I mean, do people really change? I think a lot of people have been meditating for a long time, start to wonder, am I really changing? Do people really change? And it begins to niggle. And I think our spiritual practice and awakening needs to be so profound that it's convincing. That it convinces not only we convinced, but that others would be convinced also know that this is real.
So hearing you talk again, you spoke about, and also you spoke about this in your book about the need for clarity and to be serious and to be earnest, and much of that is let's say and rational and clear thinking. And I'm thinking like one of the let's say confessions you made that in your book was that the approach had been too masculine, in a sense. So I'm always thinking about that, the difference between the masculine and the feminine approach to spirituality, if there is a difference. And we would think in the postmodern age that no, there's no difference because we're all kind of the same. And do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that my approach, I guess, would still be considered to be more masculine than it is feminine, but because I came up against my own limitations, my own blindness, my own ignorance, my own selfishness, and my own sometimes meanness, I've had to forgive myself for a lot of my own shadow issues, and therefore I've become a lot kinder to myself and with other people, because I realized that being human is becoming fully human is a challenging endeavor. And from an evolutionary point of view, we're all always works in progress. That from an evolutionary point of view, there's no final destination, as the old traditions would have us think, that there's a final point of final arrival, or the yonder shore from which there's no return ever again. And I don't believe that, because from an evolutionary perspective, there's always farther to go. And Western psychology has taught us that in terms of the unconscious and the unconscious and the multiple dimensions of levels that we're all deeply conditioned on, that there's no way any of us can ever get near being fully conscious. So that means we always have to be living on the razor's edge, always being very, very, very cautious and sensitive to our own blindness and to our own unconscious impulses and motivations. So I'm much kinder than I used to be, because I had an overly simplistic understanding for many years, which was that, and I still partially believe this, that freedom is a choice. That it's an experience, but it's also a choice we make to choose to have a liberated relationship to our experience. And I thought, once you get it, then you get it, or you don't get it. So, but I realized that even though I still think that's true, it can often take people many years to get to the point where they actually know how to make that choice consistently. And so, because for too long I didn't understand why people were having so much trouble making that choice, because it didn't seem to be a difficult choice for me. And so, with the crash of my community and when my life kind of fell apart, I started struggling with the same kind of issues that I saw other people struggling with, that I did my students, and I started to understand things I had never seen before from that point of view. And so, as a result, I've become a much softer, compassionate and kinder version of my old self. And I think that because of everything I've been through, people feel a lot of people feel I show up being much more deeply human. That I felt that where the place I was coming from earlier seemed to be so far away from where most people were at, that they almost couldn't where I was coming from seemed unattainable. And a lot of people would be inspired, but also felt discouraged, because how can I ever get there? But now I'm walking on the same ground as everyone else. At least I think I am. People tell me I am. And that makes the liberation that still envelops my soul that much more. It makes it for a lot of people much closer and much more attainable, because I'm not Superman anymore, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I was talking to a teacher this weekend, and he was talking about his frustration with religious traditions and how harsh they can be. And like he's saying, like in Zen, they hit you with a stick, And for
Exactly.
me, I've done Zen and I really loved that. I actually really enjoyed that. I would bow so that I would ask them to hit me with a stick. There's a masochism. I mean, it feels good because you wake up when you're meditating and you're very sleepy. And so it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have to be in that spirit, but he was saying, why do they hit you with the stick? And like, your body knows even that there's something violent in that, or something like militaristic or hyper masculine in that, which I think there's a side there is a masculine side that, but what is that? What is this masculinity? What should it be in the spiritual context?
It should be radical, uncompromising, and fierce.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say, Andrew, in response to what you just said, is that I think, at least I've come to find, I found out a long time ago, and I don't hear enough spiritual teachers talking about it, that when we get serious about enlightenment, when we get serious about awakening, there are all kinds of forces that are present in consciousness that get stirred up. So on the positive side, I feel that, like I'm fond of saying, that the consciousness delights in its own self-recognition. So when somebody awakens to consciousness, to their own experience of consciousness, this sounds metaphysically strange, but it seems that the ground of consciousness itself experiences delight. Now that's a strange thing I'm saying. I don't know how else to put it. But I'm trying to say that we're not alone in this. That there are spiritual, there are forces in the universe that are working on our behalf to help us to awaken, even if we're not normally aware of them. So when we become very sincere, we find we can be helped in ways we didn't expect from unseen and mysterious forces. And I don't mean to make this sound too ludicrous, but it's actually true. And at the same time, there are also forces at work within us that would very much are antagonistic towards our own deeper development. And when someone gets very serious about awakening, when their heart gets so touched and they realize that enlightenment is possible, the ego can get very frightened. And when the ego gets very frightened, it can be very destructive. And so in relationship to these masculine and feminine sides of ourselves, I think that how do we deal with these powerful forces that get awakened in us? Some of these forces, I said, are the force of love and awakened divinity, and some are diabolical and very much want to interfere with our progress. So to answer your question, at times the best way to respond to these forces is with love and kindness and compassion and encouragement. And other times, sometimes there has to be a kind of a fierceness and a determination that means no, I'm not kidding. I actually really mean this. Because a lot of people don't take their own potential for enlightenment very seriously. And I think, and for example, when the Buddha sat down under the Bodhi tree and he said, "I'm not going to get up until I'm enlightened," he wasn't playing games. He wasn't going to leave the outcome anything but assured. So he was utterly determined what the outcome was going to be. And I think that to awaken that kind of determination in us, sometimes we need some fierce encouragement to do nothing but take our own potential seriously enough.
Yeah, and the Buddha left his family and his castle, and
He sure did.
It's an interesting thing to think about too. And like, okay, so if we are serious about enlightenment, does that mean staying or leaving?
Well, it depends. It's a very good question, Andrew. It depends. So the problem is, you and I are having this discussion in a postmodern context or a postmodern context. So in a postmodern context, the idea of leaving your family behind for the pursuit of consciousness, it would seem utterly ludicrous and irresponsible, and the expression of some kind of madness that will lead one to ending up in some kind of dangerous cult, and it couldn't mean anything else. But in 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, even 500 years ago, in Eastern culture, this was respected. People could understand that there is a higher, what's called a higher calling, and a higher calling will demand in some people will create this necessity to leave everything behind for God, for spiritual realization. And that's the kind of calling I felt. It was absolute, it was unconditional, and it was total. And some people feel called with that kind of intensity. For other people don't. I think the problem with that kind of calling right now is that there's no room in our shared cultural background to make sense out of that kind of calling as for being anything other than totally crazy. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Because of the materialism and the narcissism and small-mindedness and the materialism and the cultural narcissism. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. The cultural narcissism. But one of the things that happened with me, because just to answer your question about why did I make up my own path, is because when I was in those days, people were getting so turned on that they wanted to leave everything behind. And I saw many times this phenomenon of a couple would come, and let's say the wife got really excited and was no longer concerned about her
the husband,
her world, her previously understood to be so-called more materialistic or worldly ambitions and values, maybe even including the husband. It wasn't anything I did. It was just the spiritual inspiration they were experiencing had this kind of effect. And people have accused me of breaking up marriages, but I wasn't doing anything like that. I was just seeing some people wake up to a higher possibility, and as a result, become interested in something that challenged a lot of these postmodern cliches and ideals.
Mm-hmm.
But the cultural context couldn't make sense of it, and then of course when people aren't so spiritually inspired, they start to think about it in a different way. They don't see it in the way they were seeing it when their most inspired moments. But I feel very much that we need, that you and I are both loosely part of a group of people that are interested in postmodernity. What's the next cultural context going to look like? And I hope there's room in this next step for radical spirituality for those of us who want to take it all the way. Now, what does it mean to take it all the way? We don't even know, but we want the inspired motivation to take it all the way, to be legally sanctioned and rationally appreciated as a noble and as a noble aspiration that has just an historical context.
That doesn't seem very likely in the larger culture. What?
No, not at all.
Not in the smaller cultures. On the other hand, I sort of feel like in the larger culture, it's becoming more impossible, and in the smaller cultures that are emerging, that it's like a really good time, actually, in some sense, because the larger culture is so corrupt and they're not burning witches or whatever to do this kind of thing. If that makes any sense.
No, absolutely. But the more I think about it, like it was in a meeting I had last night, I was realizing that how do we do this? If we're sincere, how do we do this? We can't do this on our own. When the Buddha was asked the question, is association with like-minded people a part of the holy life? Apparently his response was, association with like-minded people is the whole of the holy life.
Yeah.
So I think as autonomous and as sovereign as we like to think that we are in our postmodern narcissistic identities, I think most of us are far less sovereign, far less autonomous than we think we are. A lot of us are looking to other people for cues and clues as we try and make sense out of the complexity of being human, especially at a time like this. So therefore, with the people that we're closest to, what values do we share? What values do we share? And do we talk about these values consistently? Are we always talking about them, trying to make sense of them, and trying to make sense out of the complexity of our lives in the context of those values that we are sharing consciously and rationally and deliberately? I think it's something that has to be constantly worked on in a very conscious way. Otherwise, we're just going to slip and slide all over the place, as a lot of people do in terms of their thinking.
Yeah. Well, I'm finding that Zoom is a surprisingly good place where it actually, like, these kind of conversations are sort of, there's an intensity you could have intense conversations because you're skipping all of the a lot of the ordinary social chit chat that you might have with your coworkers or the people in your ordinary life, and you kind of magnetize towards people who are like you, and so you can have very deep conversations very quickly. There's a huge danger in that as well, but
well, yeah. Well, I sometimes I have found sometimes have a very vulnerable connection with somebody, then you just go click.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then it's
exactly.
not.
Then it's over. Yeah.
It's then one can suddenly feel like a little alone, yes, and kind of left hanging in a strange way.
Yes, that's yeah, that's very true, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Well, again, there's another question that comes up, of course, and that is the big guru question.
Oh,
Because,
sure, I'd love to talk about that.
Because something you said in the book, which I totally agreed with, and I've been saying the same thing, because there was a meme kind of in the culture saying that the Sangha is going to be the guru or something like that, or the Sangha is everything now, and therefore, that seemed to be saying to me that, oh, the Buddha and the Dharma don't matter anymore, so let's just get rid of hierarchy completely, and we can all do it ourselves, and it's a do-it-yourself kind of thing. And I was like, no. That was my feeling towards that statement. And there might be something true in that as well, but on the other hand, guru is a very dirty word in this culture at the moment.
The worst.
It's the worst word ever. And if you are a Roshi or a Sadiq or any kind of, in all cultures, there's different versions of that. But the word guru, God, that's a bad word. Should we just throw it away or use another word?
Well, no, let's talk about it. So I probably shouldn't say this, but my dear friend Ken Wilber said to me about 10 years ago when I asked him the same question. He said this line that came from Thich Nhat Hanh, that the next Buddha is the Sangha. He said it's a green mean fantasy.
Yeah.
Now, so the issue here is that, as you're very well aware, that postmodernity hates hierarchy.
Yes.
So the problem is that in postmodern Western materialistic culture, we don't know what category to put spiritual development in. So in other words, we could say, I used to want to be a jazz drummer. So you could say, Andrew knows, I don't know what your background is. You say, well, Andrew is more advanced and more developed in his understanding of percussion and rhythm, especially in a jazz context, than Andrew Sweeney is. And people say, oh, I imagine that must be the case. And then we could say, well, what's your hobby, Andrew? What do you really like to do besides what we're doing now?
Oh, well, I guess music and poetry and writing. Mm-hmm.
So you could say, but you could say Andrew Sweeney knows a lot more about writing and poetry than Andrew Cohen. You say, oh, I can understand that. So that's not threatening, but the thing is, there's this postmodern belief that all human beings are inherently equal, and the problem is that when we begin to look at spiritual development in the context of ascension or verticality, then we start discovering that some people are more spiritually enlightened than others.
Yeah. And just even more talented on a banal level. Like, I'm a teacher as well. And I ask my students sometimes, I say, who are your idols? Who do you worship? Because when I was a guitar player, it was like, Jimi Hendrix and whatever, but they don't worship anybody but themselves or something. And that's a problem. Like they don't have idols the way we did. They probably do. Maybe they just don't want to talk to me about it, but I can think of, like, when I was a teenager and a young person, about 20, 30, 40 people who I just idolize and I put way higher than myself. And I, still feel that way, but it seems to be hard for people to have heroes or.
No, I think it's a culturally conditioned narcissism. It's not anybody's fault. And it started with us, the baby boomers, and then with our kids, it got even worse. And so the problem in relation to what you asked me is that it's very hard in that context to imagine it's because how this is heard by a lot of people, if you say someone who's more spiritually developed, how it's heard is, are you saying so-and-so is more human than me? No, I'm not saying they're more human, but they have a certain human capacity to which they may be more developed in. But a lot of people hear that as a threat, not as an interesting, compelling possibility. What do you mean someone's more spiritually developed? What the hell does that really mean anyway? Because it sounds interesting.
Well, how do you measure that? I mean, I think one of the problem is we kind of think in measurement terms or something. So I guess there's a problem with not Ken Wilber's system, but using this sort of hierarchical system of putting people into different categories of development is that the person creating the category system is at the top, and then everybody else is, so it feels a bit like you're measuring something that can't. Can you measure this sort of thing? Or,
well, I absolutely, of course we can, because if we couldn't measure that, it wouldn't be real. So, for example, when I met, I had several spiritual teachers, but when I met my own guru, it became pretty obvious to me after a couple of days that this man was living in a different universe than the one I was living in. His access to consciousness and a whole depth dimension was infinitely beyond anything that I'd ever encountered. And not only my own narcissism, but my own arrogance was challenged by his palpable spiritual depth. I remember one day I was sitting with him. He was living at his son's house, and a very, and my whole identity was built up being a meditator in those days. So then a very ordinary older Indian woman came in, dressed very plainly. And she obviously respected him a lot. She touched his feet when she came in. And he says to me, he says, Andrew, he said, she's enlightened. I thought, what the hell is he talking about? This is the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard. He said, ask her any question you want. So I remember I said, I don't remember what her name was, but I said, excuse me, madam. I asked her a question about meditation. And she said without hesitating, she said, oh, it's good for beginners. She said, with utterly unself, without any self-consciousness, with utter confidence. And I thought, what does she know that I don't know? She obviously knew something. She was in her relationship to consciousness was completely in another category than mine was. And so the answer to your question is,
so you're just saying there is a vertical depth, right? You're not saying that you can measure it.
Of course. Well, I'm sure it could be measured in some way, but what I'm saying is, because what I always wanted to know, Andrew, is I had a very powerful awakening experience when I was a kid, like a lot of people do when they're teenagers. I had a very powerful experience when I was a teenager, so I knew that enlightenment was real because of that. But when I became a serious seeker, I wanted to know, well, what does enlightenment look like? How does it walk like and talk like and act like? So then I would spend time with different teachers and I would scrutinize them because I wanted to know, what does this thing really look like when it's not just a state, but it's a way of being human. And then I started to notice that some people had access to greater not depth of just being, but also depth of care, of consciousness, of attention, of compassion, of kindness, and more connected to a sense of ultimate meaning and value in relation to life itself, that they seem to be living through them. They just have so much more weight as conscious beings. And this can only be felt by getting to know people who are more conscious than we are, to get to know them personally and spending more time with them, and you can start to feel the difference. I remember once when I was starting my seeking process when I was about 22, 23, going out to an ashram on Long Island to hear a very famous Swami named Swami Chidananda, who was a chief disciple of the famous Swami Shivananda. And when this man walked in the room, I was utterly struck. He was very thin. He was very thin. He had a Gandhi-like persona. And when he sat down, I could see the purity in his being, the purity of self, the purity of consciousness, the purity in his kindness and authenticity. And I could feel what a gross character I was in comparison. I could feel the vulgarity of my own ego, of my own, so my thought process, my my self-obsession. I could just feel how gross I was in comparison to this what appeared to be a very a saintly being. And later on, when I became a teacher myself, he became one of my mentors. And everything that I had perceived about him at that first meeting turned out to be absolutely true. I mean, I never had met anybody so that expressed this purity of being in a way that just literally reflected back my own, all the ways in which I was sorely lacking in comparison. And it was a big wake-up call. It was a hell of a wake-up call. And I wanted to respond to what you said about Krishnamurti before, because my personal opinion is he wasn't a great communicator of the Dharma, even though he traveled around and giving talks. But I felt he was an extraordinary exemplar of elegant consciousness. In other words, when people would listen to him speak and just behold his presence, or I knew that he was different. There was something about him that was, he'd been touched by something that most people haven't been touched by. So his presence was convincing that enlightenment was real, even though I think that a lot of people who followed him didn't have any idea what he was talking about, including me.
Yeah. I mean, he was so beautiful in his expression. And,
exactly.
But I remember Chogyam Trimpa, who was fat Tibetan guy, also a great master, saying that he was an arhat, in the sense, an arhat is the word, is like a solitary realizer that couldn't really communicate. Like
he was
couldn't give a teaching, or couldn't transmit a lineage or something like that.
But he was a great communicator.
What? Yes. Well, excuse me. Well, maybe that he was too pure or something. He was just too pure for everybody. And that's why this frustration, I think this Jungian guy was speaking about, is like, he was pure, but he wasn't stooping down to my level and able to communicate with me, or that's what. Anyway, this is just a story I heard. So I've never met Krishnamurti, but.
Well, yeah, but anyway, I think, for example, like I saw Trimpa give a talk once, but I never personally met him. But some of my students have been students of his, and people told me that if you got to know him, you couldn't help but fall in love with him. Men and women just completely fell in love and adored him. They couldn't resist his radiant presence was so beautiful. So that's, for example, an example of being in the presence of somebody who transmits a level of depth that's unusual, and it's extraordinary, it's profound, and it's miraculous, and it convinces us that higher development is attainable, and these exemplars would inspire us to begin to make spiritual effort ourselves, so we can become like them.
Yeah. What about the difference between, let's say this like sutric path, which is about discipline and compassion and purity and the moral rigor and ethics, and for the most part, and then the tantric path, which is very, very sort of like, there's supposed to be the tantric path, which is direct experience of energetic being and without filter. And do you relate to that kind of? So I was thinking of that Krishnamurti sort of was a great sutric teacher, and that Trimpa was the great tantric teacher. That's how I sort of see it, but maybe I'm wrong, and what do I know? I mean, these are just my categories.
I think we need both. We need powerful energetic experiences that are spiritually convincing and spiritually are so profound and so powerful that they wake us up way beyond our mind, and we begin to experience this non-relative or absolute dimension of reality. It's at such a level of intensity that we become spiritually convinced, and even if only temporarily awaken to enlightened awareness, then we come back saying, "Oh, I've seen it, I've experienced it, I know what the Buddha was speaking about because I've seen it myself." So on one hand, on the other hand, we need to work on having a clear understanding of what these higher states mean and what they reveal to us. Because once again, we want to interpret these higher state experiences in a way that helps us make sense out of relative reality. Because as I was saying earlier, relative reality is the world we are all actually going to live in, no matter how enlightened in terms of these higher states of consciousness we may believe ourselves to be or may actually be. This relative world of relative realities where we've got to live, where we have to make decisions, and where we're going to succeed or fail, and create better world, or fail at doing that. I mean, this is where it counts. So I think that the energetic experiences are important to convince us that God exists and is the ultimate reality. But we need to, as I was saying, constantly work on being able to make sense out of this, of what everything means. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be you? And with all the, within the context of the complexity, all the complexity that's led up to this moment of having this conversation. How big is the context that any individual, including us right now, are seeing this all happen? And of course, I think the wiser the individual, the bigger is the context that they're holding. And that's something in the context. In order to develop that kind of context, we need to work on it. Spiritual practice every day. Who am I? Where am I? Why am I here? So, yeah.
Yeah, you said earlier that you felt like you needed to teach your students how to, about thinking. That I talk to a lot of philosophers, a lot of intellectuals. I talk to a lot of people from all kinds of, backgrounds and ideas, and a lot of, people who are really into books and thinking, and Hegelian and phenomenologists and people like that. And then I also know a lot of spiritual people who speak about the intellect as being something to overcome or destroy, or so that we could have this pure egoless state. And I always sort of put myself somewhere in the middle, of saying that you do need to train the intellect up to a certain point. And I know that I personally probably made the mistake of going into a lot of practices without really knowing what I was doing, and I would have benefited from studying. And so now studying seems to be important to me. Do you have any thoughts about that? About the
Well,
intellect?
sure. So I think having a healthy, well-developed intellect is very important.
Yeah,
it's very important. But in the spiritual context, or the Enlightenment context, the intellect can become problematic to the degree that our ego is identified with it. So the problem is, a lot of really wicked smart people know they're wicked smart, and their ego tends to be identified with the fact that, oh, I'm aware of how wicked smart I am, and then the intellect becomes an obstacle to deeper wisdom, and to capacity to be a deeper, selfless, radiant self. And so then the ego can become the intellect can become a huge obstacle to people whose egos are identified with it. But if our ego is not so intensely identified with our intellect can be our great guide, a great servant. Mm-hmm. And it's wicked. It's a wicked problem for a lot of people, especially these days when there's so many more smart people seem to be popping up. And sometimes when I hear some of the conversations you have with people, I've been jealous of your capacity to kind of engage on so many different topics. So the intellect is very important, and we want to learn how to be intellectually rigorous and have a strong intellectual capacity. But we have to be if we're interested in the freedom of enlightened awareness, we need to be very careful not to be identified with at the level of ego. Much easier said than done. So there's nothing more impressive than meeting a wicked smart person who demonstrates genuine humility, that demonstrates a non-attachment to their own brilliance.
Right. Yeah. So again, that humility seems to be the key here.
Yeah, it's very rare. Humility is a very hard-won virtue, and yeah, because ultimately, the spiritual freedom of enlightened awareness comes from letting go of the mind. And if you're a wicked smart person, the last thing you want to let go of is your mind, because your mind is your source of self-confidence and self-power, personal power.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a double-edged sword. So on the other hand, there are some people who had a lot of very deep non-dual experiences and feel that the mind is the enemy, and so then they're against thinking, and so they end up preaching kind of a stupid enlightenment where cultivation of a razor sharp intellect is frowned upon, and that's just the expression of their own ignorance.
Yeah, I mean, Well, I was talking to somebody in Zen who said in Zen you kind of train the intellect indirectly, like so that you learn to really express yourself in a kind of simple way. I guess they call that prajna, or simple, direct way. On the other hand, there's more elaborate people who like elaboration and who like, expressiveness, and who like me, who like Vajrayana and poetry and kind of the more colorful aspects. Probably because I'm too dumb to just sit there and,
You don't seem dumb to me.
Well, I mean, I think sitting in Zen was, I didn't get very far doing Zen practice because I wanted more material to work with. I was too greedy. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, you can do both. Zen is the best way to let go of everything, because you'll go back to zero unconditionally, radically, and absolutely. And then when you're finished, you can go back to cultivate your intellect. But I'm just repeating what I said a few minutes ago. It's so ironic because in watching some of your dialogues with other people, I've been amazed at the range of topics that you're able to converse with a reasonable degree of confidence in is impressive.
Oh,
So,
thank you very much. Yeah. Well, no, I think, yeah, I want to work on multiple levels and on multiple things. I don't want to just stick with, I guess that's a blessing and a curse in some ways, because I'm too, I go in too many directions all at once. But anyway, thank you for saying that.
yeah, but it's the sign of if we're doing how well we're doing is how creatively, how constructively and creatively are we living the life we're living right now. So you seem to be living a constructive and creative life that is developing and evolving in a meaningful and rational way. So that's a very good sign.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, there's one question I want. Again, we talked about this just a little bit before we started to record, and that is groups.
Sure.
Because I've been involved in groups recently, and that was never kind of my thing before. And I found myself the head of a group, and I found the extreme complexities and difficulties of that situation, and how vulnerable a group is to all kinds of things, scapegoating and just losing its center. And I guess you have a direct experience of running this worldwide organization and being the head of this group, and then having the entire house of cards just kind of collapse. So maybe you have some advice for me about how to work with people in a group, because that's just kind of a new I mean, I have worked in little groups, but mostly as a participant, and especially as you were talking to Layman and Bruce about leadership a bit, and that was the original reason I wanted to reach out to you a bit, because I was thinking about, okay, so how does leadership avoid becoming tyranny on one hand and anarchy, and then without leadership on the other? Because I found that very difficult.
Well, it's a very difficult question. It's a very hard question.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that has become clear to me is that without leadership, without powerful and trustworthy leadership, we can't get anywhere. And of course, if we have excelled in a particular area of development, at a certain point, their capacity for leadership should begin to show itself quite naturally and spontaneously.
Right. That's the important thing, perhaps, is that if one, because there's a lot of, I went to a men's workshop and everybody there was supposed to be a leader, right?
Oh no.
It's like there were like no participants because everybody was, was being, I think in these groups they're selling leadership or something.
That sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah. But then there's this natural sort of leadership, which sort of maybe something calls us to be at a certain point, and
well, if the leadership is coming from authenticity, then it becomes an expression of a natural gift, a natural capacity, then people will recognize it and will respond to it. But I don't think being a leader is something we can try to do, because that's the ego trying to.
Yeah, of course.
Trying to be something that it's not.
Yeah.
So I think leadership only works if you have been able to convince people that you know what you're talking about, and that this is a great line in Shivananda Ashram in Rishikesh in northern India. There's a line on the wall. There's a plaque, which I read about 25 years ago, and it said, "Teaching means being."
Yeah.
Teaching means being. And I remember when I read that, I was really struck. So it means if we're going to be a leader, if we're going to be able to teach, we need to be able to be the expression of what it is we're teaching. And if we can do that, other people will be convinced, and people who want to learn from us will be attracted to us.
Right.
Because other people are going to believe us are going to give us the benefit of the doubt only for so long, especially these days.
Especially these days. Well,
yeah, especially these days. If you're supposed to be, if you're supposed to know what you're talking about, people are going to expect you to prove it pretty quick. Otherwise, they're going to click.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just the experience. I guess you were originally the experience of being canceled. Let's say. That was another question I had, or I wanted your comments about, because because of what you went through and because of all the criticisms, and then there's this term that arose in popular culture, cancel culture, and all that. I think we're living in a kind of unforgiving culture that that tries to be thinks that it's very benevolent, but it's brutally unforgiving, and we don't even have good old Catholic confession and forgiveness anymore. We just want to say to somebody who's done wrong, you just wanted to destroy them or something. So how do we bring back mercy and compassion and for people who have who have done things that have hurt other people and done wrong, and at a certain point
what you're saying is painfully true, and I think about the question you brought up a lot because of my own experience, and I think the only solution, there's only one solution to the problem, is that we have to find the spiritual strength and the spiritual conviction to do better and to be better ourselves. But we have to find the spiritual strength and the conviction to be kinder and more forgiving than other people may have been with us. I for example, when I was younger and more arrogant, which wasn't that long ago, I could be very self-righteous. And now when I hear other people being too self-righteous, I feel myself withdrawing with caution, and I feel a reticence about being too self-righteous about anything because of everything that I've been through. I think we all have to be careful, and want to strive to be more forgiving and more compassionate, even if it's hard for us, because as you said, the intersubjective cultural world space has become so unforgiving, so black and white, and so self-righteous in so many domains of culture that it's become very painful and frightening. A lot of people are very frightened and don't have the courage to say things and to be themselves because they're afraid of being shot down or humiliated or personally violated. If we're daring to be vulnerable and honest, it's terrible.
And you do have to sort of subject yourself to a certain amount of you have to negativity if you put yourself out there. Like you have to subject yourself to a lot of other people's projections and darknesses and
amen, brother.
Yeah. So I guess that is part of is that part of sort of like becoming more human and becoming able to deal with the blows of, or something like that. How does that not destroy you, and how does that actually make you more, let's say, just more human? It's just that seems to be the whole thing, right? More humble and more human and more able to connect to the divine as well, right?
But what has saved me from losing the plot completely in some of my weakest and darkest moments has been trying to stay with my own understanding of what I believe the truth to be. So so what is actually going on here? What actually is the truth? If one is being harshly criticized, you want to say, well, what is true about what's being said? Because if there's something true there, I want to learn from it. I want to integrate this. And what about where the people are coming from? What about where other people are coming from is not true, and it's just an expression of their own shadow and their own projections. And we have to try to be very clear about that. If the man said the truth and set you free, and that's what saved me in some of my darkest moments, and still does. Because we're all human, and it's painful to be canceled and to be condemned and to be vilified. No, it's not easy. But
then there's a tendency to want to apologize. Like you said, you went on your apology tour. I quote in your book for the people that got hurt in the dynamics of your community. I've noticed that if I have done something wrong and then I go to apologize to somebody about it, it often makes it worse. Or so how do we, like, I guess in traditional religion there's a way to, let's say, atone for things, and that's very important, like this process of atoning for when we've done something wrong. Let's say to ourselves, I did something wrong there, and I'm sorry about that, and maybe I can do something, or but yeah, it just seems to be, where is the line here?
Well, I think that being able to apologize in a way that's going to be heard, if it's going to be heard, there has to be a measure of trust and respect there.
Yeah.
Because if someone has closed their heart to you, then nothing you say to them is going to make any difference, because they literally don't care anymore. And that's the problem. And so relating to what we were saying a few minutes ago, if we believe we're spiritually developed, that's a place we never want to get to, that we never want to shut ourselves off completely from any other person. No matter how atrociously we may feel they have behaved, we still want there to be a human connection between us. Because the minute you write somebody off, you stop seeing their own humanity. And so therefore you're going to stop listening. And so, and if they are in a position where they're trying to atone for something they've done wrong, however imperfectly they may be attempting to do it, we won't recognize it, and we won't even want to recognize it, because we'll just want to hold the grudge, unfortunately. Because what I try and do is I try and see all these things we're speaking about in the biggest context, that this is part and parcel of the human condition. This is how human beings have mistreated each other and betrayed each other for millennia. And so a very powerful way not to personalize the challenges of our own personal circumstances is to see it in a larger developmental context, and then to develop compassion for ourselves and for everyone else in this kind of context. It makes it easier to survive and to become spiritually more authentic.
One of the most powerful articulations of, let's say, the shadow that I've seen was the work of René Girard. He talks about how there's a scapegoating mechanism really at the beginning in culture, right? Because he says the first stone on the temple was like a sacrificial altar. It's like somebody needs to be sacrificed so that the community can. There's a tension that develops in the community of the war of all against all, and then you choose a sacrificial scapegoat, and you sacrifice that scapegoat, and then there's peace for a while, and then it's a way of sort of letting go of the steam of the culture, and that's like our unconscious humanity, there's always, it seems like there's always this sort of scapegoat mechanism at work, and there's always it's like a temptation to want to vilify somebody, because this is going to relieve you of the tension of your own darkness or your own shadow. Or
sure, and often we project our own shadows onto other people, and then want to destroy them as a way of avoiding our own shame.
Of course.
So yeah, what I wanted to say was, in response to what you're saying, is it's all painfully true, and it has been painfully true for a long time. But we all have to learn. We all have to make. I think we all have to be willing to make the effort to do better, because doing better is not necessarily spiritually an easy thing to do. But I think if we're spiritually inspired and motivated and believe in a higher principle, then we have to make the effort to do better ourselves, even if the other or the others will not or are not or will not. I don't think there's any other way to respond that makes deep sense.
Take the higher ground in a sense.
Yeah, we have to own it, own the whole problem at a deeper level if we have the courage to do that. Because this is how human beings have been treating each other for a long time. But I wanted to get back to what you were saying about, if you don't mind, about the challenging issues of group dynamics, group psychological, emotional, and spiritual dynamics. And getting back to what we were saying about what I was saying earlier about sharing higher values with our most intimate friends, is that the goal in the meta modern movement, I've noticed, is less about personal enlightenment and more about the attainment of a radical and profound and powerful sovereignty and autonomy.
Yeah.
And I can clearly understand why powerful sovereignty and autonomy and independence is so necessary and important in these times where there's so much confusion about what's real and what's true. That a lot of the smartest people are saying we have to learn how to sense make in the midst of all this complexity and confusion, and they're completely right. But that's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, most people don't truly think for themselves about that much. A lot of people are very lazy thinkers and kind of take on board what people who they respect and look up to think and assume it's true. Very few people have done the hard philosophical work of really starting from scratch and trying to make sense out of life and purpose and meaning for themselves. So if you're working with a group of people, the majority of whom obviously haven't dug that deep yet, then the group can be emotionally swayed very easily or spiritually swayed very easily by the experience of higher states, the opinions of what some of the smarter people in the group say is real. And then as you could experience these crazy and frightening dynamics that you said you experienced with your own group, where people can be very positive and then turn on a dime and become very destructive, almost like a wave passes through the group. Yeah. Yes. And then this happens when there are very few sovereign individuals, truly sovereign, autonomous individuals in the group. And so it's one thing that surprised me and I continue to be surprised how few people actually think deeply for themselves about anything, and therefore we're so easily manipulated by circumstances, by other people's opinions. And of course, everything that happened with the pandemic revealed that to us in a larger cultural level in ways that have been a big wake-up call and have been so frightening and so disillusioning about human nature. So this is kind of the leading edge. I think where we have to work at the level of culture in order to wake up so this kind of stuff stops happening. But it happens in politics, it happens in religious context and in spiritual context and elevated philosophical context also.
Yeah. Well, I think you need a strong peer group or some people who are there's thinking for yourself, but there's also having friends who you trust and who are critical thinkers themselves about these sort of situations, or you can get kind of. Well, anyway, that was kind of my experience. That the only way I could sort of figure out a certain group dynamic was speaking to other people.
No, amen. That's the most important thing is having deep friendships, but real deep friendships that aren't, and as I was saying earlier, they're not just personal, they're not based just upon a personal loyalty and lived experience, but based upon shared values. Because, for example, if our friendship is based upon higher values, if that's what our friendship is based upon, that's going to become more important to you and more important to me. If the fact that you would be true to those values and I would be true to those values would be more important to us than any other aspect of our relationship, and it would be something we'd be willing to hold each other to if we really loved each other and if we cared about each other. That way, we'd be really our relationship in our relationship. We would be standing for something that was more important than our individuality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure.
But the dynamics, the intersubjective dynamics in groups can be sublime, can reveal to us some sublime depths of human potential, and can also be demonic and destructive.
Well, I guess so often it goes to the sublime wave or something. There's like this burst of, and then that's when things start to get destructive. It's like you can see that on so many different levels. You can see that in like I was thinking, I was like, somebody becomes Lenin, somebody becomes Trotsky, somebody becomes, and they're all very idealistic in the beginning, and they have this great new future. And you also spoke a little bit about this kind of revolutionary impulse that you felt, and I think that's an interesting thing to look at as well.
Well, the revolutionary impulse, I felt it as is in the awakening to enlightened awareness. One begins to feel so much potential, because at least temporarily one transcends the small egoic mind and wakes up to an experience of universal potential that's so bright with possibility. And and that brightness is so infinitely compelling, and it promises it's a utopian. It's compelled by the utopian potential, which is of course so dangerous.
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to sort of get at. So maybe these guys, in the Russian Revolution had some of this feeling of.
Sure they did. They
had this vision of this utopia, and the whole culture in Germany was very artistic and advanced.
Sure.
And all things were, but then you see it go dark and slide into the worst possible.
The way I've come to think about it and speak about it lately is there is an absolute. Being a mystic, I boldly declare in public, unconsciously, that there is an absolute that exists beyond the mind, beyond time, beyond space. And the knowledge of that absolute is the source of unconditional liberation and enlightened awareness, which is real and can save us all. But at the same time, the only thing that's absolute is the absolute. And outside that context, we have to be terrified and very careful of absolutism. Uh-huh. So absolutism means I'm right and you're wrong. And in relative reality, all truths are partial. All truths are partial. There's no such thing as being absolutely right about anything. There's always going to be another perspective. There's always going to be a partial. All truths are partial, and that means that all truths are partial. So the absolute is the absolute. But the problem is, I'm sure in Marx's awakening to what he saw as the solution to the human predicament, he was inspired by the evolutionary impulse and inspired by utopian idealism. Mm-hmm. As even Hitler was.
But he also needed a scapegoat, which was like the bourgeoisie or something like that.
Well, sure, but what makes that kind of inspiration dangerous is when it's expressed in absolutistic terms. When the realizer expresses absolutism, and absolutism is an unfailing belief in one's own perspective as being absolutely right and absolutely true. And just to repeat, there's no perspective in relative reality that's absolutely true about anything.
Got it. There is no absolute perspective from the perspective of relative reality. There's just a bunch of perspectives.
Exactly, exactly. So if we can we hold the paradox between if we've realized that there is an absolute, then have the courage to dare to testify to honor that transparently and take responsibility for it in public, which is a dangerous thing to do.
In public, it's a dangerous thing to do. Yeah, it would seem.
But refuse an absolutistic relationship to anything else. Ever refuse absolutism. It has to be seen as.
I like that a lot. That's very helpful. Hold
that paradox constantly. So there is an absolute, but nothing in relative reality is absolute, except the absolute. And hold that paradox, and that will keep us safe from all the failings of utopian idealism. So so a lot of intelligent, sensitive, thoughtful, philosophically oriented people are very reticent and critical about utopian idealism because they look at all the disasters it's led to. And you say, yes, it has led to those disasters for this particular reason that I'm speaking about right now, because of absolutism. But the utopian impulse is what created the universe in the first place. When something came from nothing, it was a big yes. I believe it was the expression of a cosmic absolute yes. And that yes, or that reaching towards a perfection that's unattainable, is part of what's is this pure positivity that I believe is driving the creative process at the deepest, most interior levels. And the spiritual
pure
experience.
positivity. Yeah, I mean, this is the hard thing. Like I was reading in Jewish mythology about Keter as like supposed to be the absolute, and it's supposed to be absolute compassion, not supposed to be the ultimate reality. And then I'm thinking, where's the evidence for that? In this bone-crushing universe. And so I can see the attraction of the atheistic perspective, because the other perspective is just faith, I guess, until it's been realized, or just moments, or just openings of perhaps inklings of that.
Well, the positivity I'm speaking about only comes from an experience of revelation about the ultimate nature of reality. So all the greatest realizers would testify to this awakening and this recognition that at the deepest level of reality there is a pure positivity that's non-relative and that's absolute, and which simply is. And when we realize, when we've experienced that, then it gives us the faith to live a courageous and heroic life in the midst of samsara, in the midst of all of this hell and damnation and pain and suffering, because we know that what's driving all this is love. And if our faith is very strong, and this is what realizers are, how they're tested, is that, and this is easy to say and very difficult to live, is that ultimately we would want to get to the point that where no experience of pain or suffering or agony would ever cause us to doubt the ultimate truth.
Yeah, that's
the challenge for all awakened mystics, because as you've said very clearly, life can be tough and rough and unforgiving, and so we need to be able to cultivate the spiritual self-confidence to learn how to be spiritually strong in the midst of the temptation to doubt.
Yeah, that seemed very Christian in a way. I mean, the Christ thing is being able to. I mean, that's the ultimate sort of ability to take on, to have that kind of faith. But
well, my guru once said to me, and I think he was quoting Ramana Maharshi, and this is something that blew my mind when he said it, and it continues to blow my mind now, which is that the only difference between enlightenment and unenlightenment is doubt.
There's doubt.
So he said, Andrew, when you cease to discriminate between samsara and nirvana, you'll be free. Easier said than done.
Oh, I mentioned Christianity, and of course I'm thinking of Jesus on the cross saying, "Why have you forsaken me?"
Exactly.
Having this ultimate doubt at the very end, and then not, I guess, but
sure, but to be true to that example of Jesus on the cross, we're all, in the end, we're all human, and we're all subject to frailty and fear and pain also.
Yeah.
No matter how enlightened we may be, as I told you, if you come to Ramana Ashram here, you see this great realizer on the verge of death is wincing in pain. So it's dealing with this paradox between relative reality and absolute reality, which is, you know, wrestling with that paradox as heroically as we can is a big part of what living the spiritual life in earnest is all about, I believe. And there's no perfect way to pull it off because we're all imperfect vehicles.
Maybe go back a little bit, because there's still a question in my mind about the difference between utopia and, let's say, the promised land or the city of the hill, or you know, it would seem that the Marxist plan is to build a utopia, a perfect world on Earth. Whereas is that the goal? Whereas instead of it being sort of like try to make this world, which is obviously has its heavens and hells and horrors in it, you know, incredibly much better, or but also enlightened consciousness entering the world. But is it ever going to become not those things?
Well, you remember also in Mahayana Buddhism, they talk about the land of Shambhala.
Sure.
Trungpa Rinpoche spoke about the land of Shambhala. So it seems that in the awakening to enlightened awareness, some people who are in deeply realized souls, it becomes there's awakened in them a vision of the land of Shambhala, which is the Eastern notion of heaven.
Yeah.
So
but it's supposed to have existed on the earth. It's not up there somewhere, you know. It's
sure, exactly.
And it's also not in time, in the sense, on the ultimate sense, right? It's not like an actual. I mean, maybe it was a place in the Himalayas at one point, but seems unlikely.
Well, when we awaken to enlightened awareness, we awaken to the land of Shambhala here and now.
Yeah.
And then when you awaken to other people to that same state of consciousness, then everybody's aware that they are awakened to this heavenly potential here and now as a felt experience, as a felt cognition. Now that doesn't make our ignorance disappear. So, but it becomes something that suddenly it's within reach, because when you experience that depth of potential, you feel spiritually compelled to try to actualize it. And that's why so many awakened individuals and groups of awakened individuals have tried to do it so many times and have failed so many times. But the aspiration doesn't go away, because the impulse comes from the creative source of the universe itself. It keeps reappearing because that's what's driving this whole process. It doesn't disappear because a lot of groups have failed, and the smartest people said we're never going to do that again, because the creative impulse comes from the source of the universe. I believe that's what created the universe. But it's going to continue to reappear. And so my question is, can we hold this? The way to protect ourselves from the inevitable failing and falling that always happens? Can we hold this inevitable paradox, this challenging, infinitely compelling paradox between relative and absolute, and never crossing that line, never allowing that which is relative to be seen as being absolute, never absolutizing anything except the absolute itself?
So crossing the line would be either abandoning the world for the absolute, or it would be abandoning the absolute for the world.
Well,
that would be crossing the line?
No, it would mean mistaking something that's relative for being absolute.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's the problem, because otherwise everything. Then we see everything is relative. And the way I understand it is that in our most inspired and awakened moments, we feel compelled to reach for that which is we feel compelled to reach for that which is impossible to attain. So we realize I'll never be able to attain this, but I feel I have to reach for it because I have nothing else to do. So I'm gonna reach with all of my energy for something that I'll never attain, and in that reaching, a new space, a new potential is going to reveal itself that wouldn't unless I was willing to stretch that far. And that's where I think emergence actually comes into being. So I know I'm never going to arrive, but I feel so spiritually inspired that I'm going to do everything I can to achieve the impossible, knowing that I'm going to fail. But even though I know I'm going to fail, I'm not going to stop. And because I'm not going to stop, something new from an evolutionary standpoint will come into being.
Right. Sort of like Moses not making it to the promised land, but then striving fully, and then till the next, I guess, the next iteration of being the future.
Well, it's because because in relative reality, there's no final arrival.
Yeah. Also, yeah.
There's no final arrival. But if we
It's
give up,
paradoxical again, right?
it's paradoxical again. Because can we hold the paradox? Because if we give everything for the promise of the possible, then new potentials begin to reveal themselves that would have never revealed themselves unless we stretched that far. Because if we feel it's not possible and or it's so dangerous and stupid, we never want to try that again, then we close the door. And so we want to keep the door open while learning from the past failings and the past mistakes. And I think then we don't lose touch with our own awakened innocence and inspiration. Can we do it better? Even though what we're speaking about it's an impossible aspiration, but striving for that which is impossible, consciously knowing that we're never going to succeed, is a kind of part of the madness of is part of a kind of a rational madness that I think can lead to extraordinary results. If I'm making sense.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you said madness, and I thought crazy wisdom.
Well, no,
but that's a little different. That's a bit different.
That's different. In other words, because
you're talking about achieving something, or you're talking that can't be achieved, but you're still talking. There's still a movement forward, or in that sense.
Exactly, and it's the moving forward that becomes the all-important goal here. Because then, when the moving forward happens, that's when the universe lights up, and you realize, oh my God, it's possible. Consciousness is actually evolving through us, as us here and now. We all know it, we all feel it, we all see it. It's really happening. That's worth everything. That's worth absolutely everything. Is there a final point of arrival? No. Is there a final attainment? No. But do we have the courage to stay in that space of total insecurity and which requires total commitment? Because that's where the most exciting dimension of the universe reveals itself, I believe. But it requires this total commitment and this total risk-taking and trust in spirit. And yet at the same time, being ferociously rational and very disciplined, for us not to get too carried away with our own experiences and with our own visions also. Mm-hmm. It's an infinite paradox and an infinite balancing act that needs to happen. Because I'm just repeating what I just said a minute ago, but the thing is, what most of the smartest and most sensitive and intelligent people do is because of how many times we've all failed, and because of how dangerous it is, people close the door. Yeah. And then there's a lot of other wonderful things to do in life, but in terms of this particular dimension of evolutionary potential, it can only be realized through maintaining this delicate balance I'm speaking about, which for most people is hard to grasp.
Well, maybe just some people want to live full lives, and that's fine. And then there's other people who are on the edge. I don't know. Exactly.
But I think, a life fully lived from a spiritual point of view comes from it's when we're conscious, it's when we become conscious of the deeper terrain in which we're all traveling here. And aligning ourselves with as much as possible.
Well, I guess I'm still, there was one more thing that came up when we were speaking, and again, it's like this, again, you speak a lot about transcendence and this transcendent phallic. My friend Alexander Bard always talks about the phallus, and this constructive mentality. And it seems that that's kind of the counter spirit of the age in a way.
It seems like it.
It would appear that the phallic or the constructive, is almost has to appear when the society has become so cynical and nihilistic and I don't know. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Well, it does make sense. In other words, and now everybody's interested in embodiment and dealing with shadow and
Yeah.
and authenticity and being real, which is all a big part of what it means to be an awakened human being. But I think that for a lot of complex reasons and a lot of simple reasons, a lot of people have given up on transcendence. And
Yes.
and yeah, and that's what you're responding to, and I agree with you. So for me personally, in my own life experience, the experience of transcendence has been what has changed everything and continued to change everything. What has saved me over and over again from mediocrity and from samsara and from ignorance and foolishness. So when I speak, I can't help but speak about the miracle of transcendence. I don't have a choice. I personally feel that if we've been touched by absolute spirit, we will show up as vulnerable, deeply human, heart-centered human beings. Even more than if that had never happened. But what you said a minute ago is very true.
Well, I don't know if any other questions are appearing at this moment, Andrew. Do you want to maybe tell people what your projects are, what you're up to, what you're hoping to achieve and do and create in the next few years?
Well, I'm kind of a one-trick pony. I think you've kind of nailed me to the wall here in terms of being a transcender. I've had a very delightful conversation with you. I'm very touched by your vulnerability and your openness and your curiosity. What I'm very interested in at this point is the evolution of the triple gem. And you're a Buddhist practitioner, so the triple gem is the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the teacher, the teaching, and the community. And
the Guru, the Deva, and the Dakini. That's the inner part.
Yeah, amen, amen. So I've become quite convinced that structure of the triple gem is the most powerful and profound vehicle in which consciousness can be awakened individually and collectively. So the project I'm working on is that this idea of the triple gem came into prominence about 3,000 years ago in the traditional era. So what does the triple gem look like when it takes the journey from the traditional era to the modern era to the postmodern era to the post or meta-modern era? What does it actually look like? How does it walk like and talk like and act like? And what shape does that structure look like now? And how is it different than the traditional one? And this is what I'm working on. And it's a work in progress. And I don't have the answer to the question yet, but I'm going to devote the rest of my life to answering that question, because when the pieces are in place, when all these three pieces are in place and they're working, the Dharma comes alive. It explodes, and it explodes with the level of vibrancy and intensity that becomes world changing at some level. And it's almost like when you get those pieces in place, it's like lighting a fire. A fire gets lit, and the fire starts burning, and then it's the fire of consciousness itself that's awake to itself individually and collectively. And when all those structures are in place, sorry, I'm losing my way. So answering that question is what I'm devoting the rest of my life to, and I haven't found the answer yet. I'm aware of the problems with the traditional structure, the traditional expression of the triple gem that doesn't work in postmodernity for a lot of obvious reasons, because postmodernity has educated us and made us understand that there's no such thing as a perfect human being, and the world we're living in needs a dharma that can embrace all dimensions of life in ways that often traditional dharma can't. So that's what my for the rest of my life project is, that, and to do a much better job of being who I am and giving the gifts that I've been given to give.
Wonderful. Yeah, I that's wonderful. That's great. I mean, I think that's hopefully my aspiration and project as well. I at a much more humble level than you, but how do I say that? Yeah. I guess we do what we can with what we have in the moment, and
that's what we're here to do.
yeah. There's somebody. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andrew.
I'm sorry. I'm finished. Go ahead.
No, there's a few people who have come in and out, because we had this conversation in the afternoon, and I invited a few people from my community, and there's a guy named Jacob who's here, and some people came and left, and I left it sort of open for people if they had any questions for Andrew. So Jacob, are you there? Do you have a question for Andrew or not?
Hey guys, thanks Andrew for inviting me in.
Hey
Jacob. I was thinking, hello Andrew, the other Andrew.
Hi.
I met you actually once, Andrew, at I think it was the Transpersonal Psychology Conference in Moscow in 2010.
Oh yes, sure. Yeah, I was there.
Is that true? I was there with I don't know if you remember her. She was speaking to my then girlfriend from the Damanhur community in Italy, Esperide, Ananas.
Oh yes, I remember that. I remember we had some connection with them. I think we did an article on you guys.
Yeah, probably. Vibrant lady. She was quite a bit older than me, but she was an interesting. She taught me a lot. Anyway, do I have a question? Well, I didn't. I missed the beginning of the conversation, so I don't know how much you touched upon this. But I haven't followed all of your story and your process. But I know that you fell from the pinnacle of being a big teacher at some point, and there was a lot of brouhaha around that, I guess. I was just curious if you would share a little bit on how was the personal experience of that for you, for being so successful, and then I didn't even know all the details of what happened, but if you would want to share a little bit of your personal experience of that rise and fall.
Well, a book just came out that I wrote about it called When Shadow Meets the Bodhisattva, which goes into a lot of detail about that question, which I couldn't possibly go into here. Andrew just read the book, and he told me that he was moved by it, which I very much appreciate. But in a word, it was hellacious and awful and painful and deeply humbling.
I can imagine. So how would you say 2 more words about that? Like when shadow meets the Bodhisattva, how did you?
Well, I'll
read the book, of course, but yeah.
Well, I told Andrew that my shadow was I had a particularly bad one. My shadow was that I believed I didn't have a shadow.
Dangerous.
So very dangerous. So that got me into a lot of trouble. And even now, when I think about it, it's obviously ludicrous. But it was that was the reason why I was missing a lot of signals that the world was trying to give me that I missed, because I was so convinced of my own purity and perfection, which obviously wasn't the case. So this led to kind of a personal and collective disaster, and I tried to, in writing the book, in the book I tell a personal story, but I also speak about the Dharma and the evolution of the Dharma in the book, and the enormous complexity of being a guru in a postmodern context, who was awake to evolution and integral theory, but was still very identified with a lot of mythic principles about himself and about enlightenment that needed to be upgraded. So I got caught in a lot of different traps, and a lot of suffering was a result also of a lot of my students suffered as a result of the fact that the whole world we built together crashed for a lot of reasons that weren't only because of me. So I've come out the other side after this happened 10 years ago. So I've come out the other side, and I'm hoping that I'm going to be a better teacher and a better man and a better understanding of how to do this right as a result of all the agony and confusion that was a result. That's my hope.
Interesting.
It's interesting that you're the
Thanks for
only.
sharing.
Sorry
Thank
to interrupt, Jacob. Yeah, excuse me.
No, so yeah, so just would you even say that did you fall into the trap of absolutism yourself?
Yeah,
That you just mentioned.
Yes.
Okay.
Guilty as charged.
But you're the only guy who's admitted it. You know.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. I mean, there's so many gurus who have, you know, I can't see Osho going, being repentant after creating like a cult with bio-terrorists, and you know, even though he was a wonderful teacher in many ways himself. So it's very interesting that.
But he kind of had Sheila, his assistant, embody his shadow. No, it seems.
True. That's very true.
Right. That's a good point.
Very true.
Judging from the documentary, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. He didn't talk. He just let this whole thing happen around him.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for sharing, Andrew. That's interesting. I think, but in a way, our greatest mistakes is what we can learn the most from it.
Yes, I amen to that. I think I'm in the process of still doing that. I think I will be for the rest of my life.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob, for popping in. So are we moving towards wrapping up here? And Andrew, is there anything else you want to say, or you think
I feel very complete. I feel very grateful because, as I said, you're very you have a unique kind of spontaneity in the way that you think and respond. That's very deep and very personal at the same time. I feel very grateful, and I feel complete.
Yeah, great. Me too. I also want to mention I'm talking to your friend Mark Gaffney soon.
Oh, cool.
I know you're having a series with him, so I think we're talking on April 3rd. I'm starting a series with Mark, and so there's a lot of things going on. I'm also having another talk with Zevi Slavin, who's a wonderful Hasidic practitioner. Rabbi, yeah. And
he was great. That was an amazing talk.
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt,
guy,
but it was awesome.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, for coming to or listening to that. Yeah. So anyway, we got lots of nice conversations. I'm super happy that I reached out to you, Andrew, and very pleased to meet you, and hope we can do it again sometime.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much.